"My son says the bracelet's for my protection," Margaret Lane said, as her fingers hovered over the signature line. By nightfall, he'd lost access to her accounts, her property, and her medical records. He called it caregiving. She called it surveillance. He'd turned her life into a spreadsheet. But with one pen stroke, she deleted the formula. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." Eugene, Oregon, Thursday, 11:14 a.m. Margaret Lane opened the small velvet box the way one might open an eviction notice, slowly, with a sense that whatever came next might not be reversible. Inside sat a matte black bracelet, sleek, modern, more medical device than jewelry. She lifted it between thumb and forefinger like it might hum or hiss. Jason watched her from across the kitchen island, arms folded. His expression was that polished concern she'd seen since the day his father's ashes cooled. Efficient, sanitized, hard to argue with. "It's for your safety, Mom," he said. "Just a little insurance. You had that stumble by the birdbath last week. What if you'd hit your head?" Margaret smiled, tight and tidy. "Then the squirrels would have called 911. Jason didn't laugh. He slid the charger across the counter. "It's GPS-enabled, fall detection, real-time vitals. Bree picked it out herself." "Of course she did," Margaret said. As if summoned, Bree appeared in the doorway with her usual practiced ease, holding her phone at just the right angle. "Smile, Margaret. Gifting moment." Margaret didn't. The camera clicked anyway. 10 minutes later, the photo was online. "Keeping our loved ones safe. Shuck grateful. Shuck elder care tech." Margaret sat very still, hands in her lap. She had survived a marriage, a cancer scare, a county budget war over library funding, and 4 decades of raising a son who thought bullet points counted as love. She could survive a bracelet, but surviving wasn't the same as trusting. That afternoon, in the garden behind her Victorian, Margaret clipped spent roses while Judith Klein tugged weeds from the edge of the iris bed. Judith wore denim-like armor and a straw hat she'd probably bought during Reagan's first term. "So they chipped you," Judith muttered. "It's not a chip," Margaret replied. Judith snorted. "It talks to his phone, doesn't it?" Margaret hesitated. "Allegedly." Judith wiped her hands on her apron. "Devices go both ways, hun. 1 minute it's fall detection. Next minute it's, 'Mom, why'd you spend $42 at the yarn store?'" Margaret clipped another bloom, thorns scratching her glove. She went inside and charged the bracelet anyway. That night she put it on, just for a test. She walked 3 blocks to the corner bakery, bought a half loaf of sourdough, then stood in the aisle of the co-op for 15 minutes debating whether her plants preferred fish emulsion or worm castings. When she returned home, there was a text waiting. From Jason, "Saw you left the house. Everything okay?" Her chest tightened, not from fear, from fury dressed as concern. She stared at the message, thumb hovering. Then, in an act of profound Midwestern defiance, she left him on read. At 2:43 a.m., Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, bracelet glowing dimly on her wrist like a lighthouse that watched her. She opened her journal. He means well. That's the dangerous part. The road to control is always paved with just in case. Downstairs, the porch creaked with summer wind. Margaret didn't move, didn't take off the bracelet, but she pulled a towel from the linen closet and laid it gently over the security camera Jason had installed last Christmas. A gift, he'd called it. Then she returned to bed, heart quiet, breath slow. Let him think she was safe. Let him believe she was grateful. She'd keep wearing the bracelet, but only long enough to see where he went next. Eugene, Oregon, Sunday, 9:32 a.m. Margaret Lane adjusted the laptop screen so it caught just enough of her living room without showing the neatly folded estate folders beside her teacup. The video call rang out with that digital trill she already resented. Then, click. The camera flickered. Jason's face filled the screen, forehead already creased like he was stepping into a problem he hadn't yet named. "Hey, Mom," he said brightly, too brightly. Bree appeared half a beat later, backlit by what looked like a ring light, her blonde hair coiled into a gym-perfect bun. "Good morning, Margaret. You look well. Love the sweater. Is that hand-knit?" "It's 20 years old," Margaret said, "still holding together, like some of us." Jason chuckled. Bree did not. "So," Jason said, tapping at something off-screen. "We've been talking and thought it might be helpful to get a few of your accounts a little more streamlined." Margaret tilted her head. "Your utilities, cell plan, pharmacy notifications," he continued, "stuff like that. I can link everything through my dashboard and make sure nothing slips through. Less for you to juggle." "I prefer juggling," Margaret said, sipping her tea. Bree leaned forward, voice syrupy. "It's just easier this way, Margaret. Trust me, I do this for my aging clients all the time. Consolidation reduces risk." Margaret smiled tightly. "Risk of what?" There was a pause, thin and metallic through the Wi-Fi. "Of errors," Jason said, "of forgetting, of missing things when you're tired." "I'm not tired." "Well, not yet," Bree said, too quickly. "But later. You know. Aging is cumulative." Before Margaret could respond, another window popped into the call. Zoe. "Hey," she said, blinking into the camera, a blur of dorm room behind her, textbooks stacked by a lava lamp, a corkboard pinned with tiny Polaroids. "Hi, Grandma." Margaret's face softened. "Hello, sweetheart." Jason glanced off screen. "We're just wrapping up, Zoe, talking about finances and how to make things smoother for Grandma." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "Like smoother how?" Jason kept his voice light. "Bill management, emergency access, just in case." "In case of what?" Zoe asked, arms folding. Bree jumped in. "Well, say your grandma needed to go into care suddenly or had a medical event. Jason needs to be able to move funds, authorize things, maybe access the mortgage account just to keep things flowing." Margaret stayed silent, fingers lightly tapping the edge of her teacup. Jason added, "It's not power of attorney. Yet. Just prep." Zoe glanced at Margaret, her face unreadable. Then she said, "Well, if you guys are good here, I have chem lab in 10. Love you, Grandma." "Love you too," Margaret said with a warmth that didn't stretch an inch beyond the frame. Click. Zoe's screen vanished. Jason's face sharpened. "Look, Mom, I'm not trying to invade anything, but if you were ever incapacitated, you'd want someone you trust in place." Margaret placed her teacup gently on the saucer. "I trust myself," she said. Bree exhaled audibly, like she was tired of being misunderstood. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Margaret smiled. "You'd be surprised what I can handle." After they hung up, the house was still. The bracelet on her wrist blinked once. Low battery. She didn't plug it in. Instead, Margaret opened her journal and turned to a fresh page. Today they used the word streamline. I believe the synonym is erasure. They don't ask what I want. They tell me what's safer. She paused, wrote one last line. Control wears many masks. Sometimes it smiles through a screen. Then she looked out the window at her garden. The roses were still sleeping, but the daffodils were pushing through. She closed the journal, locked it in her desk drawer, and made a call. "Judith," she said, "can you come over this afternoon? Bring your shovel." Margaret glanced down at the bracelet. "We're going to do a little digging." Eugene, Oregon, Monday, 10:47 a.m. Margaret's pruning shears made a clean snip through the stem of a yellow rose, the petals curling slightly like a secret whispered to no one. Dew clung to her sleeves as she leaned in farther, methodically moving from bloom to bloom. Her Victorian was silent behind her, exactly how she preferred it lately. Judith knelt a few feet away, gloved hands buried in damp soil, tugging out crabgrass with the kind of vengeance reserved for bad exes and corrupt aldermen. "You ever heard of the Carlson case?" she asked, tossing a root into the compost bucket. Margaret blinked. "Should I have?" Widow, 69, thought she was getting help from her nephew with her electric bill. Turned out he rerouted her stimulus checks into a crypto account and used her house as collateral for a loan he couldn't spell, let alone repay. Margaret winced. That can't be common. Judith looked up. It's getting there. 1 in 5 now. Most don't even know it's happening until the lights go out or the deed's gone. She wiped her brow. Devices, shared logins, linked cards. It's all marketed as convenience. That's what they call it right before they strip your autonomy bare. Margaret clipped another stem. And here I thought I was just being paranoid. You're being observant, Judith said. That's the difference between a victim and a witness. Later that afternoon, Margaret logged into her utility portal to pay her water bill, out of habit more than need. Something caught her eye. A name. Bree Lane, co-account holder. Her stomach dipped, cold and sharp. She checked the account history. The change had been made 3 days ago. She hadn't requested it. She hadn't authorized it. She stared at the screen for a long minute, then reached for the landline, dialing with deliberate calm. Hey, Mom, Jason answered after 2 rings, chipper and brisk. Everything okay? Did you add Bree to my water account? A pause. Then, yeah, I meant to mention that. It's just easier this way. She handles a lot of our billing stuff. I didn't approve that. It's not a big deal, Mom. It's just a utility account. It's my utility account. Jason sighed audibly. You're becoming a liability, Mom. Don't make this harder than it is. The line went dead quiet. Margaret hadn't hung up, but she no longer needed to speak. She reached for her journal instead, logged the call. 3:12 p.m. Jason. Words used, liability, tone, efficient, cold, confident. She tucked the notebook under the cushion of her reading chair, then she called Judith. 10 minutes later, Judith pulled up to the curb in her rickety Subaru, engine coughing in protest. She stepped out holding a manila folder and a business card. Name's Naomi Tran, she said. Elder rights, financial abuse, smart as hell, doesn't flinch when men raise their voices or women lose everything. Margaret took the card and read it twice, then nodded. Let's see how deep this root system goes. Naomi arrived the next morning, sharp-angled and composed in a charcoal blazer and walking shoes. She shook Margaret's hand with both of hers. No rush, Naomi said, but the sooner we look, the clearer the trail. Margaret offered coffee and led her to the sunroom, where the light cut through lace curtains like it had something to confess. For the next 2 hours, Naomi combed through bank statements, browser histories, insurance documents, and email notifications. Her expression didn't change, just her pen color. By noon, she closed her legal pad and met Margaret's eyes. Your instincts were right, she said. They've already started the slow roll. Relabeling control as care. This isn't about help, it's about access. Margaret folded her hands. What do I do? Naomi stood. You document, you prepare, and you let them believe they're still winning. Margaret smiled, tight and razor-thin. Then let's give them a show. As Naomi gathered her files and headed out, Margaret sat back down at her writing desk, pen poised above a fresh journal page. Then her phone buzzed. Text from Bree. Just made sure your phone plan's connected to our billing too. All streamlined now. Margaret stared at it for just a second, then deleted the message without replying. Across the garden the roses shimmered in the breeze, tender and thorned all at once. She picked up her pen and began to write. Willamette Riverfront, Eugene, Saturday, 11:28 a.m. The sun glittered off the river like it had secrets to tell. Margaret Lane stepped onto the patio of the Blue Heron Bistro in a tailored navy coat, the matte black bracelet snug on her wrist like a brand she hadn't asked for. She'd left her gloves off intentionally. Let them see it. Let them believe it was working. Jason stood to greet her, holding a reservation sign like he'd won a raffle. There she is, our matriarch in motion, he said. Right on time. Bree was already seated, adjusting the angle of a linen napkin like it might impact her reflection. We were just saying how glad we are you're wearing the bracelet, she said loudly, flashing a smile toward the other diners. No more wandering, right? Safety first. Margaret returned a smile of her own, thin, contained. I always know where I'm going. Right, Bree replied with a grin that didn't reach her eyes. But now we do too. Margaret's chair scraped softly against the flagstone as she sat down. Zoe looked up from her corner of the table, where she was pushing pieces of avocado around a plate. Their eyes met. Zoe blinked once, slowly, like a signal light only Margaret could read. The waiter arrived, menus were passed, mimosas poured. Jason waved away the wine list. Just orange juice for Mom, he said with the casual command of a man who'd already made the decision days ago. Margaret ordered black coffee instead. Jason raised his glass. To future planning. No drama, no surprises, just a well-lit path forward. Margaret tilted her head. What kind of surprises did you have in mind? Jason chuckled. Nothing like that. I'm just saying it's easier when everyone's on the same page, especially when certain transitions come up. Bree chimed in, her voice syrupy. Like assisted living, estate simplification, digital consolidation, little things that make aging graceful. Margaret reached for her water. Grace doesn't require surrender. Zoe coughed into her napkin, hiding the hint of a smile. Jason pressed on. It's all hypothetical, Mom. We just want to be prepared, you know? Margaret dabbed at the corner of her mouth with her napkin, then folded it precisely on her plate. Well, she said lightly, you'll be glad to know I've started a bit of estate maintenance myself. Jason's fork paused mid-air. You have? Nothing major. Just some minor paperwork, updating files, moving things around. Bree leaned in. If there's anything we can help with? There isn't, Margaret said, tone still pleasant. But thank you for the enthusiasm. Jason exhaled. Good. Honestly, it's a relief. Bree's been pushing me to get our side organized too. Always best to prepare for the inevitable, Bree said, sipping her mimosa. Zoe pushed back her chair. I'm going to grab a muffin from the counter. Be right back. Margaret nodded without looking. Bring 2. Zoe stopped, looked back. 2? For later, Margaret said, folding her hands. When brunch ended, Jason insisted on walking Margaret to her car. Bree trailed behind, checking her reflection in her phone screen. Jason held the door open. You really okay, Mom? Margaret settled into the driver's seat. Jason, you always ask that like it's a diagnosis. I just want to make sure you're protected. The world's changing fast. She glanced down at the bracelet. Yes, but I've seen fast change before. Nixon, NAFTA, Google. Jason leaned down, voice low. I'm trying to keep you safe. Margaret looked up at him. You're trying to keep me manageable. Jason blinked. Margaret smiled. But you've always confused the two, haven't you? She shut the door before he could reply. As she pulled away from the curb, Zoe's reflection caught in the cafe window. She was watching, not waving, just watching. Back home, Margaret set one of the muffins on a small china plate. The other she slid into a manila envelope beside a flash drive labeled Accounts Old. She wrote a single note. Don't confuse quiet with consent. Then sealed the envelope and tucked it inside the piano bench, beneath faded sheet music and memories she didn't owe anyone. And across the room, the bracelet blinked. Once. Still on, still tracking, but not for much longer. Eugene, Oregon, Monday, 7:42 p.m. The bracelet lay on the oak table like a silent witness. Margaret had slipped it off after her evening walk, then placed it precisely on top of a folded dish towel, like it was still dangerous to touch bare. Naomi Tran sat across from her, laptop open, glasses sliding halfway down her nose as her fingers skimmed across the keyboard. The room was warm with chamomile and tension. I don't want to overreact, Margaret said. Naomi didn't look up. I'm not in the business of overreaction. I'm in the business of proof. She clicked something, then turned the screen around. A web of timestamps, IP addresses, app permissions, sync logs. At the center, a data pulse tagged Margaret Lane, primary profile. On the edge of the chart, Jason Lane, linked access, Bracelet Sync app, financial dashboards. Margaret's lips parted, but no words emerged. Naomi spoke evenly. He's been watching, not just your vitals, your spending, your location, your mortgage settings. There's a feature in the app, buried deep, that offers third-party integration. He ran a valuation projection on your property 3 nights ago. Margaret pressed a hand to her collarbone, her breath shallow. And a cost of care calculator, Naomi added. Institutional. The room swam for a moment. Margaret steadied herself against the armrest. I agreed to the bracelet, she whispered, but I never gave him permission for this. You didn't need to, Naomi said. He created the permissions himself. He claimed power he was never given. That's not tech literacy. That's digital trespass. Margaret sat back, spine tall again. What do we do? She asked. Naomi's eyes flashed. We draft a cease and desist. We revoke all digital proxies. We report unauthorized financial monitoring under Oregon Statute 124.005, and then... Margaret raised a hand. No? Naomi blinked. No? Not yet, Margaret said. No fire alarms, no warning shots. If we pull the thread now, they'll hide what's left. Let them think I'm still soft, still slow, still busy trimming roses. Naomi sat very still. You're asking me to delay action on an active abuse trace. I'm asking you, Margaret said, voice razor flat, to let them finish building their trap, so I can own the blueprint. Later that night, Margaret returned the bracelet to her wrist, not as surrender, as camouflage. She sat by the window, journal open, the pages now numbered and cross-referenced, conversations, transfers, comments, passive slights recorded in tidy cursive. The teacup beside her steamed in the moonlight, then her phone buzzed. One new email. From zo.lane@wilsonu.edu. Subject, something I heard. Grandma. I didn't know who else to tell. Dad said you'd be easier to manage if things stayed linked. He called the bracelet a workaround when he didn't think I was listening. And Mom? She's been emailing a realtor. They're calling it Phase 2. I don't know what that means, but I'm here. Just say the word. Margaret stared at the screen. A breeze lifted the edge of her journal. She didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, she reached into her desk drawer, pulled out a small brass key labeled Judith, backup, and laid it beside the laptop. Then she turned off the lights. The bracelet blinked once in the dark. Obedient. Silent. Margaret whispered, "Let them watch." She smiled to herself. They think they're collecting data. She closed the journal. I'm collecting evidence. And in the morning, they'd never know what changed, only that it had already begun. Eugene, Oregon, Tuesday, 6:54 a.m. The first thing Margaret Lane did before breakfast was burn a note card. She lit the corner with the long-handled match she used for candles, watched it curl and smoke inside a ceramic bowl. It had contained every password she'd used since 2013. Her banking login, the streaming account she never watched, her electric bill, and Jason's birthday once disguised as a PIN. By 7 a.m., her laptop was a fortress. Every account unlinked, every passphrase changed, every two-step authentication routed through a burner number Naomi had preloaded on a fresh flip phone. No syncing, no voice commands, no location tracking, just numbers, just names she chose to keep. Judith arrived by 8:30, balancing a mason jar of black coffee in one hand and a battered accordion folder in the other. I brought the paperwork buffet, she announced, dropping it on the dining table with a thud. Wills, deeds, titles, that half-finished letter to AARP you swore you mailed. Margaret gave a dry smile. Never underestimate a good filing system, or a good liar. Together they worked through the morning, shuffling papers, cross-referencing dates, flagging items for Naomi. The bracelet stayed on Margaret's wrist, still blinking in quiet submission, still streaming data like an obedient spy. Judith held up a laminated page. "You still keeping a physical key to your safety deposit box?" "Not anymore." Margaret pulled a manila envelope from the side drawer and removed its contents, 2 sets of notarized forms, freshly printed and signed. She slid one into her purse and the other into Judith's hand. "Box is under Naomi's name now. If anything happens to me, suddenly or suspiciously, Naomi takes the box. You take the journal." Judith glanced at her. "What are we expecting? A Netflix doc?" Margaret shrugged. "I don't plan to be a cautionary tale, but if I become one, I'd like to be properly archived." At noon, Margaret stood in the fluorescent chill of First Willamette Bank, watching as a balding clerk slid her new documents into a reinforced steel drawer. "Anything else you want to store today, Mrs. Lane?" he asked. Margaret tapped the top of her purse. "Just the right to breathe without supervision." He didn't laugh. She didn't expect him to. She got home by 1:17. The air was still, the garden was quiet, the mail sat undisturbed in its wrought iron box, and Jason's Tesla was in her driveway. Margaret stood by her front steps a full minute before unlocking the door. Inside, Jason was already in the kitchen, opened her fridge, poured himself water. Like this was still his staging ground. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone that same manicured casual he used on Zoom calls and HOA meetings. "Just dropped by to check on you." "I didn't call," Margaret said. "You didn't have to." He held up his phone. "Bracelet says you were out for a few hours. I got worried." Margaret tilted her head. "Do I ping like a smoke alarm now?" Jason frowned. "It's just peace of mind. I didn't mean to intrude." "But here you are." She gestured toward the dining room. "Tea?" Jason followed her, eyes narrowing at the absence of her old laptop and the new burner phone plugged into a wall outlet. She poured chamomile and handed him a cup. "Rough week?" she asked, voice mild. "You look tight in the jaw. Stressful times at the company?" Jason blinked. Yeah, a little. We're restructuring some of the leadership tiers." "Why?" Margaret sat across from him. "You said you wanted to make sure I'm taken care of, but when was the last time someone asked how you're doing?" Jason blinked, unsure of where this was going. Margaret smiled, the kind that wasn't for show. "I mean it," she said, "because between all the sinking and streamlining, you seem awfully frayed." Jason opened his mouth, then closed it again. Margaret sipped her tea. Then her phone buzzed. One new voicemail. Unknown number. She tapped play. A familiar voice crackled through the speaker, female, unfamiliar tone. "You don't know me, but we have the same problem. He did it to my mother, too." Jason froze. Margaret met his eyes. "Oh," she said softly. "Looks like the stream runs both ways." And this time, it wasn't her that flinched. Eugene, Oregon, Thursday, 6:13 p.m. Margaret Lane stood on Bree's marble doorstep with a bottle of elderflower cordial she had no intention of drinking and a bracelet blinking faintly beneath her sleeve. The front door opened before she could knock. "Perfect timing," Bree beamed. "Everyone's here. Margaret, meet your future audience." Inside, the dining room glowed under pendant lights, full of people Margaret didn't recognize. Well-groomed professionals in pastel cashmere and glinting watches clustered around platters of crudité and laughter, too loud for the size of the room. "This is Sharon and Ken," Bree said, waving vaguely. "They're starting a lifestyle podcast about intergenerational wealth. We told them all about your garden and your health routines and your estate planning journey." Margaret arched an eyebrow. That must have been a short conversation. Jason appeared at her elbow with a glass of sparkling water. "Hey, Mom. Bree's been bragging about you all week. The woman with the plan." Margaret took the glass without drinking. "And what plan is that?" He grinned. "Smart aging, of course. You're the prototype." Bree cut in, voice sugary slick. "We've been calling you our long-term wisdom asset. Pretty sure you trended for a minute after my last post." Margaret didn't answer. She just turned and scanned the table. 9 guests, 2 ring lights, and a printed card that read, "Legacy begins with a conversation." Jason clinked his glass. "Before we start dinner, I just want to say how proud we are of Mom. Adapting, embracing technology, trusting the process." There was a smattering of applause. "Let's be honest," Jason continued. "She's always been ahead of the curve. Now she's just wearing one." He gestured toward her wrist. "The bracelet, I mean. It's like a leash, but for love." Laughter. Too sharp. Margaret offered a thin smile and pulled her phone beneath the tablecloth. To Naomi Tran. Subject, status. Dinner in progress. Guests present. Language coded. Camera likely recording. Will collect names. May need file review tonight. Send. Across the table, Zoe's phone buzzed. She glanced down, frowned, then excused herself with the excuse of a call from her RA. Margaret's phone buzzed seconds later. Incoming call? Zoe Lane. She answered quietly, stepping into the hallway. "Grandma," Zoe whispered, voice tight. "I think I know where they're keeping the documents. The ones they don't want you to see." Margaret closed her eyes. "Where?" "In Dad's Dropbox, the one he uses for pitch decks. I saw a folder labeled Phase 2 and another with your name, password protected." "Can you get in?" "Maybe. I have the laptop, if I'm wrong." "You're not," Margaret said, "but be careful, Zoe." "I will. I'll let you know what I find." Margaret ended the call and returned to the table as if nothing had passed between them. Jason was now discussing generational efficiency models with a tech consultant who kept saying the word liquidate like it was a benediction. Bree refilled Margaret's glass. "Isn't this nice? Legacy doesn't have to be dramatic." Margaret's smile didn't waver. "Then you should stop scripting it." Later that night, the dining room was a graveyard of stemware and over-perfumed coats. Jason kissed her cheek on the way out. Bree air-hugged from a distance. Zoe lingered at the door, then slipped something into Margaret's coat pocket, a flash drive wrapped in a sticky note. Margaret didn't read it until they'd gone. It read, "They're trying to liquidate before you die." At 11:16 p.m., Naomi arrived at Margaret's house with a battered briefcase and 3 document folders. "This is the framework," she said. "If we pull the lever now, they won't know which piece broke their machine." Margaret opened the door wider. "Then come in," she said. "And let's start drafting the sabotage." Across town, Jason sat in his office staring at a screen. A notification blinked. Access revoked. Sync privileges expired. His hand tightened on the mouse, and in his periphery, Zoe's bedroom door closed softly, locked. Silence settled like a verdict. Tomorrow, Margaret would have the first real blueprint, but tonight, she had the weapon, and the trigger was already in motion. Eugene, Oregon, Saturday, 8:06 a.m. Margaret Lane opened the velvet pouch Naomi had left on her foyer table and withdrew the new bracelet. It was identical in weight, color, and sheen, matte black with the same subtle medical profile. Only one difference: this one wasn't linked to anything. She clipped it onto her wrist with quiet precision. The original, still warm from use, was sealed in a Ziploc bag and slipped into the back of her freezer between a bag of frozen peas and an old wedding cake tier. Let Jason track defrosting pastry if he liked. At 8:19 a.m., her phone buzzed. "Jason, a bracelet shows you've been home 3 days straight. Everything okay?" Margaret stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, "Margaret. Mostly. I've been nesting." She dropped the phone into her purse and walked out the door. Judith's Subaru screeched to a stop in front of Margaret's driveway, the engine wheezing like it had been emotionally manipulated into existence. Judith stuck her head out the window. What's on the agenda? Library? Bank heist? Or are we just collecting burner phones today? "First stop," Margaret said, climbing in. "First Willamette Trust Bank, then Cascade Credit Union, then a very specific appointment at Mid-Valley Mutual." Judith pulled away from the curb. "You know, for someone with gray hair and a pension, you have real Cold War energy lately." "I'm a retired librarian," Margaret replied. "Deception is part of the job." They reached the first bank by 9 a.m. Margaret walked in with her folder neatly labeled Elder Protection Trust Formation and a calmness that unnerved the junior banker enough to misplace his own pen 3 times. By the third institution, she no longer felt like a client. She felt like an architect. Each account was rerouted, insulated, and tied into a private trust Naomi had pre-drafted with language that was nearly poetic in its precision. The only name on the beneficiary line? Zoe Lane, held in revocable trust, protected by Naomi's firm, and legally isolated from Jason or Bree under fiduciary immunity. By 12:43 p.m., they were parked outside a taco truck near the courthouse. Margaret sipped horchata and reviewed the receipts. Judith munched on a churro and leaned over. "You know what you are?" Margaret arched an eyebrow. "You're the reason true crime podcasts are 2 seasons longer than they need to be." Margaret smiled. "Then let's give them a finale worth waiting for." That evening, as twilight folded over the garden, Margaret sat on her sun porch beneath a tangle of honeysuckle. She had just finished watering the ferns when Zoe appeared quietly beside the lattice gate. No words, just a smile, and a flash drive pressed discreetly into Margaret's palm. "I told them I was editing my psychology project," Zoe said softly. "Dad didn't even look up from his spreadsheet." Margaret nodded. "You're certain they didn't see you?" Zoe hesitated. "If they did, they didn't say anything." Inside, Margaret inserted the drive and opened the first folder. Bree Lane, Google Drive, Exports, Financial Planning 2026, Projected Inheritance, Lane Household Scenario AC. Each PDF was worse than the last. One included a tentative sale timeline of Margaret's home. Another was labeled Alternate Care Facilities, Non-Private Pay, with Bree's notes in the margin. "Jason says this is fallback if Mom resists early move." A third file showed an estimated insurance dividend table based on Margaret's expected expiration window. The tab title read, Margaret DNR, Provisional. She clicked Save All. Naomi arrived an hour later in jeans and a raincoat, eyes narrowed as she read the file names. "This," she said, clicking through the drive, "is the point where it stops being passive manipulation and starts being premeditated conversion." She closed the laptop and looked at Margaret. "We're nearing the tipping point." Margaret poured 2 glasses of elderflower cordial. "We're not tipping yet," she said. "We're still building the angle." Across town, Jason refreshed the Bracelet dashboard again. Still no movement, still no vitals shift, still no spending from the main card. He leaned back, frowning, then noticed a charge on the shared family business card, Willamette Document Imaging, $162. Jason blinked, then leaned forward. Margaret, alone again in the dim glow of her study, held up the old bracelet, now wrapped in butcher paper, and pressed a strip of tape over the package. "Return to sender." Then she wrote one word on the outside, Phase 3, and set it beside her front door. Not for mailing, for proof, because soon someone would ask when this all began. And Margaret Lane would be ready with an exact date and time. Eugene, Oregon, Sunday, 7:14 a.m. Margaret Lane stood at her kitchen counter in house shoes and a wool cardigan, watching the printer slowly feed out the contract. The pages were crisp, edges warm, as if they still remembered the heat of the war she was quietly preparing. It was the finalized document Naomi had drafted the night before, a fiduciary barrier encoded in cold, unemotional legal terms, a shield in 12 pages. Margaret slid the stack into a pale blue envelope, sealed it, and wrote a single word across the front in tidy penmanship, premature. Then she forwarded the digital copy to Naomi with one line, "File under manipulation in progress." Across town, Bree poured fresh squeezed orange juice into a double-walled glass and placed it beside a breakfast plate Zoe hadn't touched. Jason was scrolling through his phone, tapping with the fervor of someone trying to delete a bad dream. "Zoe," Bree said, smoothing her robe as if that could settle the tension. "Your father and I wanted to loop you into some of the bigger picture planning. It's important we all stay aligned." Zoe didn't look up. Aligned with what? Jason cleared his throat. With future contingencies, care directives, property transitions. Zoe stabbed her fork into her egg white omelet. You mean Grandma's house, Grandma's money. Bree raised a hand. It's more complicated than that. These things require foresight. We're not doing anything drastic, it's just logistics. She's not a portfolio, Zoe snapped, voice slicing through the granite kitchen. She's your mother. Jason looked stunned for a half-second, then fell back on his favorite posture, reasonability cloaked in control. Zoe, no one's attacking anyone. This is about protecting your grandmother's future. It's what responsible families do. Then why are you hiding it from her? Zoe's voice cracked. Why does every folder have a password and a euphemism? Bree's expression flattened. This is grown-up business, Zoe. Zoe stood up, pushed in her chair with slow, deliberate hands. Then grow up. She walked out without a coat, left the juice, the eggs, the silence. Jason didn't follow her. By 9:03 a.m., Zoe stood at Margaret's front door, cheeks flushed from the walk. Margaret opened it without a word and simply stepped aside. Inside, she handed Zoe a cup of Darjeeling tea, steeped just so, the way Zoe liked it. Loose leaf, not bagged. They sat in silence for a moment, steam rising like truth without words. I saw it all, Zoe said finally. The Dropbox, the inheritance models, the sale preparation. They're planning like you're a clock winding down. Margaret sipped slowly. You didn't flinch. No, Zoe said, but I'm done pretending. Naomi arrived before noon, papers in hand, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. She shook Zoe's hand first, formal but warm. Then she turned to Margaret. With Zoe's first-person confirmation, Naomi said, we can trigger fiduciary protective status under state code, immediate oversight, retroactive investigation, no more speculation. They become the ones explaining. Margaret nodded, calm and clear. Let's proceed. That afternoon, Jason sat at his standing desk, jaw tight, scanning the financial dashboard, what little he could still access. 2 tabs blinked with restricted access warnings. Another simply said, revoked by third-party fiduciary flag. His phone buzzed. He didn't answer at first. Then finally, he sent a text. Jason, you poisoned her against us. The reply came less than a minute later. Margaret, number you exposed yourself. That evening, Zoe sat in the sunroom while Margaret typed notes into a clean leather-bound log, a new ledger, just for this phase. Naomi prepared a courier packet on the dining table. Evidence folder, audio files, 2 sworn declarations. Outside, dusk settled over the roses. Inside, Margaret flipped a page and began her final entry for the night. Today they broke character. Tomorrow they lose the script. Eugene, Oregon, Monday, 10:46 a.m. The exam room smelled faintly of eucalyptus and fresh printer paper. Margaret Lane sat in a camel-colored cardigan and gray slacks, legs crossed, her expression open but inscrutable. Across from her, Dr. Roland Ames, a neurocognitive specialist with a Yale diploma and Oregon manners, tapped a few final notes into a tablet. May I ask, he said, looking up, why you requested the full panel? Most of my clients come in under family pressure, not of their own volition. Margaret gave a half-smile. Because when a trap is baited with my decline, I'd prefer a documented refusal to oblige. Dr. Ames chuckled softly. You're not just alert, Ms. Lane. You're strategic, articulate, and perceptive. Frankly, impressive. She tilted her head. So I passed? With distinction. Margaret rose slowly, smoothing the lines of her cardigan. Good. I'd like that in writing, and notarized. He blinked, then nodded. You'll have it this afternoon. By noon, she was on her sun porch, sipping Earl Grey while Judith clipped lavender nearby and Naomi reviewed the summary notes from a thick envelope. I haven't felt this young since Nixon resigned, Margaret said, eyes sparkling. Judith raised her mug. To clean records and dirt under fingernails. Naomi didn't smile. She was too busy highlighting phrases like executive function within optimal range and no impairment to judgment or memory in pink ink. "This changes things," she said. "They'll push harder now, but this makes their angle non-existent." Margaret sat back in her chair. "Let them push. It's how you get leverage." At 2:41 p.m., Naomi's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered on speaker, instinctively opening her voice memo app. "Naomi Tran," she said. Jason's voice came through hot and fast. "I'm putting you on notice. If you don't cease your interference with my family's affairs, I'll have grounds for a civil suit. And if you've advised my mother to take actions against my interests, I'll make sure your bar license knows it." Naomi stared out the window. "Mr. Lane, this call is being recorded and logged. Please continue." There was silence, a huff. Then the line went dead. Naomi tapped save. Judith let out a low whistle. "That's not a man in control. That's a man watching the curtain lift." That evening, Bree uploaded a video to her social channels. Filtered sunlight, soft piano. Bree, hair pulled back and eyes carefully misted, sat on a beige couch surrounded by gray pillows. She spoke into the camera like someone applying for sainthood. "There comes a time when we all must accept that we did our best, that some people just don't want the help. And while that's painful, walking away from toxicity is self-care, even when it's generational." The video ended with a quote from her yoga coach, "Let go of the legacy that refuses to love you back." Margaret saw it within minutes. She didn't comment, didn't share, didn't flinch. At 8:17 p.m., Zoe posted a photo. It was taken at twilight. Margaret in the garden, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her eyes, pruning roses with one hand and holding a mason jar of lemonade in the other. The caption read, "Resilience looks like this. Not curated, not coded, rooted, alive." The image had over 600 likes in 2 hours, no hashtags. Back at her desk, Margaret clipped the printed copy of her medical evaluation into a folder labeled Phase 4. Then she flipped to the final page of her journal for the night. He's bluffing, she's branding, and the girl they dismissed just told the truth to strangers. Her phone buzzed once more. Another voicemail, new number. She pressed play. The voice was low. Male, shaken. I didn't know she'd go this far. Call me back, please." Margaret pressed delete, then wrote one final line. "They're not worried I'll fall. They're terrified I'm standing." Eugene, Oregon, Tuesday, 9:26 a.m. The bank lobby was quiet in that corporate, carpet-muted way that made everything sound like it had consequences. Margaret Lane walked in wearing a slate blue coat and soft leather gloves. At her side, Naomi Tran moved like a shadow with purpose, briefcase in one hand, a manila folder tucked under her arm. The banker, a young man with combed-over confidence and a nameplate that read Tyler R., stood when they approached. "Ms. Lane," he said, "I've prepared the forms we discussed. We can use conference room B." Margaret nodded, her expression measured, unreadable. Inside the glass-walled room, the air hummed faintly with HVAC and tension. Tyler slid a single-page release form across the table, followed by a clean black pen. "This signature," he said, gesturing toward a bold line at the bottom, "removes all external access, past, present, and automated. It will unlink all shared users from every account under your name. No more auto alerts, no view-only permissions, no co-signatories." Margaret looked at Naomi. "This covers everything?" "Everything," Naomi replied. "Accounts, retirement funds, property lockouts, the bracelet's payment tether, even the family card Jason set up as a convenience line." Tyler cleared his throat. "We'll issue hard reset credentials, and all account pings will reroute through this office directly to you." Margaret removed her gloves, picked up the pen. Her signature was slow, elegant, and firm. Across town, Jason Lane sat in a sleek, glass-walled meeting room on the 13th floor of the Delcroft building. His phone buzzed once, then again, then it began vibrating so steadily it seemed to rattle. He glanced down. A red notification banner blinked on his screen. Access revoked. Margaret Lane. All linked financial portals. Timestamp 9:43 a.m. Action initiated by account holder. Jason froze mid-sentence, the pitch deck on his laptop forgotten. His face turned a shade redder than the company's logo. "Jason?" one of his colleagues said, glancing nervously at the screen. "You okay?" He stood without replying, shut the laptop with one hand, and walked out of the meeting. Back at First Willamette Bank, Margaret stood at the receptionist's desk, waiting for a certified copy of her revocation to be printed. The bracelet on her wrist blinked like it always had. Obedient, unknowing. Then the glass doors swung open hard enough to catch the attention of the security guard. Bree strode in, blazer sharp, lipstick sharper. "I need to speak with Margaret Lane," she said to the receptionist, voice sweetened with practiced urgency. The receptionist glanced at Naomi, then back at Bree. "Do you have an appointment?" "I'm her daughter-in-law. This is a family matter." Naomi stepped forward, calm, ready. "She's not your client," Naomi said. "She's your wake-up call." Bree's mouth opened, then closed. By 11:12 a.m., Margaret was home again, sitting at her writing desk with a fresh folder labeled "Complete Autonomy, Confirmed." She tucked the bank papers beside her medical file. The kettle whistled softly from the kitchen. As she poured the tea, her phone buzzed again. A new number. Margaret didn't answer. She opened her text app instead. One message. From Zoe. "He just left the office. He looked like something cracked." Margaret smiled faintly and typed back, "It did." In a dark parking structure downtown, Jason sat in his idling Tesla with both hands on the steering wheel. The dashboard blinked with low battery. His watch buzzed once. The bracelet tracker showed no movement, no vitals, no location, nothing. Back at the house, Margaret stood in her garden again, shears in one hand, tea in the other. Naomi stepped out onto the porch. "Well," she said, "he knows now." Margaret clipped a bloom. "Good," she said, "then he can stop pretending this is his garden." She turned toward the house, sunlight glinting off the edge of her teacup. "Because I've just pruned the roots." And behind her the rose bush bloomed red and unafraid. Eugene, Oregon. Wednesday, 8:03 a.m. The manila envelope slid across the lawyer's desk like a quiet weapon. Naomi Tran didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The clerk on the other side of the counter skimmed the heading, "Petition for Rebuttal to Emergency Conservatorship Filing," and nodded once before marking it received. Outside, the morning was glassy and windless. Inside, Margaret Lane waited in the corridor of the county courthouse, spine straight, gloves off, her fingers wrapped around the leather strap of her handbag. She didn't pace. She didn't sigh. She simply watched. She had expected the move. The timing, not so much. Jason had filed under a claim of cognitive volatility, citing erratic withdrawal activity and long-standing vulnerability to coercive influence. He even included the bracelet logs, up to the day the real one went dark. "Smart but clumsy," Naomi said in her office later, scrolling through Jason's digital filing on her monitor. He assumed no one would question the narrative if he sounded concerned enough. Margaret sipped her tea, expression cool. He was never taught that control can be traced. Naomi turned the screen to show a neatly organized folder: evidence submission, phase 4, emails, tracker metadata, auto login records, financial access trails, even audio clips of Jason's earlier calls stitched together to highlight his tonal shift, from sugary concern to clipped demands. "We're not defending your autonomy," Naomi said. "We're prosecuting their trespass." Margaret nodded. "Then let's turn the lights on." That afternoon, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and her old answering machine beside her. She played back voicemails from the past year, one after another, charting their tones like weather patterns. Jason's early calls, warm, faux affectionate. Bree's mid-year ones, transactional, clinical. The most recent, tight, edged with frustration. and something darker. She labeled each recording by date and pitch, then logged it into a timeline Naomi had built for state review. Later that evening, she clicked submit on a formal complaint through Oregon's Department of Human Services, Adult Protective Services Division. She didn't call to follow up. She didn't have to. At 6:42 p.m., a familiar voice echoed out across a campus podcast episode called Youth Mirror, Care and Consequence. It was Zoe. Her voice was calm, clear but firm. I think we spend so much time talking about how to care for elders, we ignore when care gets reversed, when the younger generation becomes the ethical backstop. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's in a Dropbox folder. Sometimes it's in the way someone tells your grandma she's too precious to make her own decisions. A beat. I watched it happen. I'm not watching it again. The clip was shared 600 times within 4 hours. At 8:17 p.m., Margaret found Judith in her sunroom chair, feet tucked beneath her, flipping through a hardcover missing its dust jacket. Judith looked up. "You remember this?" She held up the faded spine. The Art of War. Margaret gave a low chuckle. "Oh, I remember lending it to you in '89 and never getting it back." Judith handed it over. "You've earned it back. Read page 44. Margaret flipped to the marked page. A single line was underlined in green. "When the enemy overextends, let him." She closed the book slowly and smiled. That night, Jason sat at his dining table, phone clutched in one hand, the court's preliminary denial of emergency conservatorship blinking on screen. Filed opposition received, stay of proceedings enacted, further review pending protective complaint, filed by Lane. Bree walked in holding 2 glasses of wine. He didn't take one. She glanced at the screen, then narrowed her eyes. "They're stacking the optics," she said, "making us look like vultures." Jason didn't speak, but something flickered behind his eyes. Panic wasn't new, but now it had form. Back at her desk, Margaret flipped to a clean page in her new journal. She wrote, "They built the net. I rewired the cage. Tomorrow we set the lock." Her phone buzzed once. A text from Naomi. "We just became the visible hand." Margaret didn't reply. She picked up her shears and stepped into the garden under a sky sharpening with stars. Eugene, Oregon, Friday, 11:09 a.m. The notary's pen clicked once, then again before it made contact with the signature line. Margaret Lane watched, arms folded across the lapel of her linen jacket, her breath steady and even. Naomi stood beside her in charcoal slacks and a soft gray blouse, her expression neither triumphant nor smug, just surgical. The final document lay between them. Lane Private Legacy Trust, pages thick, watermarked, and revocable by one person alone. Zoe Lane. Margaret signed last. Her name looped cleanly, no tremor in the stroke. Naomi nodded, then flipped to the summary addendum. As of today, all financial and real property holdings are consolidated under the trust. Beneficiaries include Lane Family Scholarship Fund, the Oregon Council for Elder Advocacy, and Zoe Lane, trustee with conditional discretion. Margaret pressed her thumb lightly to the seal. "No mention of Jason or Bree?" she asked, not really asking. Naomi shook her head. "They no longer exist here." Margaret gave a slow smile. "Then this is the cleanest thing I've signed in years." That afternoon, Margaret sat in her study with a fountain pen and a box of heavy cream stationery, each embossed in gold leaf. M.L. "One letter at a time," she wrote to the beneficiaries. To the scholarship committee, she penned, "I once taught children to alphabetize before they could multiply. This trust is not just a gift, it is repayment for the joy they gave me. To the Elder Justice Foundation, I have learned, late but not too late, that boundaries are a love language. Let this help someone else say no before it's too late." And to Zoe, "You became my clarity before I asked you to. This trust is yours to guard, not to carry. Rewrite what they thought they wrote." She sealed each one with wax, then sat still, the silence charged with release. By dusk, news arrived in the form of an email flagged urgent civil filing collapse. Jason's lawsuit, his final card, had unraveled like cheap thread. His financial affidavits under subpoena revealed predatory interest loans taken out against Margaret's property projections 6 months prior. The math betrayed him. Bree had co-signed on 2 of them. When pressed by the court, she'd called it speculative positioning. The judge called it something else. Naomi read the summary aloud over tea. Bad faith financial conduct and coercive proximity masked as elder care. She looked up. That's a polite way of saying predator in family clothing. Margaret stirred honey into her cup. And Jason? Naomi opened a new file. I've filed a harassment and emotional distress counterclaim in your name, she said. It won't bankrupt him, but it will cost him the one thing he hates losing most. Margaret tilted her head. Time, Naomi clarified, and credibility. At 8 p.m., the fire pit in Margaret's backyard glowed amber against the Oregon twilight. Judith sat in a lawn chair nearby, wrapped in a blanket, sipping something sharp. Margaret stood barefoot in the grass, hair pinned up, the original estate binder open in her hands. She flipped past the pages one last time. Trust language Jason had once insisted was just for structure. Bree's sticky notes in the margins, old signatures once scribbled in assumption. Then she tossed it all into the flame. The fire curled around the paper, pages folding in on themselves like defeated wings. A spark leapt up, briefly, then fell. New rules now? Margaret said softly. Judith raised her glass. Amen. Across town, Jason scrolled through emails in a panic, looking for an angle that no longer existed. Every door was locked, every account empty, every silence louder than it had ever been. Back at the house, Margaret returned to her desk. She opened her journal to a new page, the ink gliding like breath across linen paper. Today, the script stopped pretending. Tomorrow, we print our own. Her phone vibrated once. A new text from Zoe. The trust doc is airtight. Just read the final clause. I cried. Margaret smiled, then typed back, so did I. But for once, they were tears of power. Eugene, Oregon, Monday, 3:42 p.m. The room at the Lane County Civic Center held no more than 50 chairs, plastic ones mismatched, but every seat was filled. At the front stood a folding podium, slightly uneven, its microphone patched with electrical tape, but Margaret Lane's voice needed no polishing. She adjusted the clip at her collar and looked out over the modest crowd, social workers, legal aides, local council members, a few adult children with nervous eyes. Naomi stood along the side wall, arms crossed, steady. Judith sat in the second row, already tearing the edge of a program with her thumbnail. I used to think that dignity meant staying silent when someone took control, Margaret began, but silence isn't dignity, it's delay. She glanced down at the single note card in her hand, then tucked it away. My name is Margaret Lane. I'm 72. I still mow my lawn. I still drive at night. And a few months ago, my family tried to turn me into an asset with a password. A quiet inhale rippled through the audience. Margaret smiled, just enough to steady herself. I'm not here to give a cautionary tale. I'm here to name what was done, and what can be done back. By the next afternoon, a short clip of Margaret's speech had been shared over 12,000 times. It wasn't flashy, just an older woman speaking clearly, plainly, with no hashtags. But that was the point. The caption read, "This is what power at 72 looks like." And under it, a comment from a verified account. An Oregon Aging Justice, we'd like to talk to Ms. Lane about policy partnership. Meanwhile, in a small corner office at Wilson University's Behavioral Sciences Annex, Zoe sat with a printout in her lap and a soft grin on her face. She looked up at the research coordinator across the desk. So, part-time? Flexible hours, the woman replied. We're studying digital coercion in elder populations. Your insights and your proximity are exactly what this panel needs. Zoe tapped the folder. Do I get to talk about how Dropbox is a villain? The coordinator smiled. You get to talk about anything you want. Across town, Jason stared at his inbox in stunned silence. 4 sponsors had quietly pulled branding deals from his consultancy's platform. One had emailed him directly. Brand alignment, misalignment, effective immediately. Next to him, Bree scrolled through their social metrics. The analytics chart was a nosedive. "Someone's circulating the video," she muttered. "The one from the dinner party, the leash but for love joke." Jason didn't answer. His phone buzzed again. Another email. Subject: termination of affiliate access, ethical branding review. Bree closed her laptop. "Well," she said coldly, "there's your legacy." Back in Margaret's kitchen, a cardboard box waited on the counter. It was filled with letters, handwritten, typed. Some folded into uneven thirds, others tucked into pale pink envelopes. Women signed them with names like Rose and Bernice and Lillian. "You said what we never could. Thank you for making it real. You reminded me I'm not furniture." Margaret read each one. She filed them alphabetically in a rosewood cabinet once meant for china. At sunset, the garden bloomed bright with yellow hollyhocks and late lavender. Judith leaned back on a folding bench, legs stretched, sipping a tall glass of lemonade. Naomi sat cross-legged on the stone path, tapping out a text to a state senator. Margaret stepped out in soft sandals, carrying a pitcher in one hand and a fresh plate of lemon cookies in the other. "You realize," Judith said, "you just made it fashionable to age with a spine." Margaret poured, "Then may the trend last." They toasted in silence, 3 women, 3 glasses, 1 breeze pushing gently through the ferns. Later, Margaret stood alone at the edge of her porch, watching the final blush of sun paint the windows gold. The house stood strong. The garden hummed. The birdsong was hers again. Still mine, still earned. Still whole. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Zoe. "Grandma, when this is over, I want to interview you for the closing episode." Margaret looked toward the darkening treetops, then whispered aloud, more to herself than anyone, "It's not over. Not yet." Eugene, Oregon, Saturday, 7:04 a.m. Margaret Lane walked barefoot through the garden, a steaming mug of black tea in one hand, her phone face down and silenced in the other. Dew sparkled along the stone path, clinging to the tips of marigolds and thyme as birds traded melodies above the hydrangeas. Each step was unhurried, as if her mind no longer needed to race ahead of her body. The house behind her was quiet, not from absence, but from peace. At the edge of the fence line, wind moved through the cedar like a whispered punctuation. And that's when she saw him. Jason stood on the other side of the front gate. No car, no briefcase, no phone in hand. Just a man in yesterday's clothes, wrinkled at the collar, blinking against the early sun. Margaret didn't speak at first. She simply walked to the gate, slow and deliberate. Her keys jingled once in her pocket before she stopped 2 feet from him. His mouth parted, but no words came. She raised a hand, not to touch, not to scold, just to pause him. "No, Jason," she said gently. "Not anymore." Then she reached for the latch and closed the gate between them with the quiet finality of a well-tended boundary. She didn't slam it, she didn't lock it, but she didn't turn back either. Inside, her phone lit up once more, his name pulsing with last attempts. She tapped Edit Contact, scrolled down, and pressed Delete. It asked, "Are you sure?" She pressed Yes. By late morning, the garden buzzed with bees and lemon balm. Margaret knelt beside a rosemary bush, dirt beneath her nails, when she heard the knock. 3 light raps on the side porch, the kind only one person made. Zoe stood there, hair in a loose braid, envelope in hand, joy barely held back. "I got it," she said, breathless. "Full ride, digital ethics and sociology. They said the committee unanimously chose me." Margaret rose slowly, brushing her palms on her apron. "I believe it," she said. "The committee has good taste." Zoe stepped forward, arms tight around her grandmother in a hug that lasted longer than either of them expected. When they finally parted, Margaret reached into the drawer beside the porch bench and pulled out a small steel lockbox. no larger than a hardback novel. She handed it to Zoe. "It's not money," she said. "It's the map I used to free myself. Letters, notes, timelines, mistakes, and revisions. Keep it. Read it someday. And then burn it." Zoe blinked. "Why burn it?" Margaret smiled. "Because I wrote it for you, not them." That evening, the sky turned the color of ripe plums. Margaret sat at her desk, one final entry waiting. She opened a fresh page in the back of her journal. No title, no date, just space. She picked up her pen and wrote, "They called me a liability. A fragile thing with fading memory, soft will, and old passwords. But I was never lost. I was misfiled." She took a deep breath, then added the last line. "But I wrote the final ledger." Then she closed the book and left it unlocked.